Arminius, a barbarian warrior who was kidnapped from his parents as a baby, raised by Rome to be a commander for the Roman Empire, but then returned to his tribe and united his people to kill over 20,000 Romans.
That's what I do, man. I kill the sun.
Depending on where you stand, Arminius is either the greatest hero ever or the greatest traitor. He's either Mowgli returning to the jungle with a human battalion and machetes to start the Mowgli Fur Trade Company, or he's a symbol of freedom against oppression. The only way to find out where Arminius stands or what he represents and how you feel about it is by telling his story. And it started in 18 BCE when Arminius was born to Segimer. Yes, Arminius and Segimer went by one name only, like Cher and Madonna. Papa Segimer was the chieftain of the Cherusci tribe, a tribe from what is now western Germany, north of the Rhine River. And since he was the son of a chieftain, Arminius was a prince, or a co-prince rather, since he also had a brother, Flavus. Both Arminius and Flavus were taken away from their family by Romans when they were 12 years young, because stealing babies was kind of Rome's thing at the time, as a way for them to ensure loyalty against the barbaric tribes they were surrounded by. This was for two reasons. One, having someone's baby is a good way to stop them from rebelling against your oppression, and two, if you can raise the baby to be loyal to Rome, you can then install it as the rightful heir in its barbaric homeland and make these lands loyal to Rome without the need for much bloodshed.
Nice, very nice. Thanks.
But then again, ask Mehmed II how that strategy turned out for him. And if you're not a massive history nerd, Mehmed II, aka Mehmed the Conqueror, ruled the Ottoman Empire and tried to do the same thing by raising a young Vlad Dracula to be loyal to the Ottomans, but adult Vlad Dracula decided to become known as Vlad the Impaler to the Ottomans instead. And it was not because of his mean peen. And to understand why Rome took such measures, you gotta understand the situation the empire was in at the time. Rome reached from the Nile to the North Sea, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. And if you're not a geography nerd, that's 2,750,000 square kilometers, which is 4 times the size of France, or about 3 times the size of Vlad Dracula's infamous mean peen. At the time, Augustus was emperor, Rome's first emperor to be exact, so he had to manage this brand new empire filled with people that were conquered and Romanized against their will, which meant a lot of resources were needed to maintain peace, and by maintaining peace, I mean to kill everybody that had a problem with Roman rule. So currently, Rome couldn't expand its empire anymore because its size was at its absolute limit, similar to Vlad Dracula's legendary mean peen. Augustus was entirely focused on maintaining and stabilizing the empire, and the most important aspect of that was border control. And one of those borders was shared with Germania, with some parts of it in and some parts of it outside of Rome, since it was so big that not all of it could fit, like Vlad Dracula's fabled meat.
No, God! No, God, please, no! No!
So mission border control with Germania was solved by stealing Germanic babies to make them Roman and eventually make them commanders of auxiliary troops that fight for the Roman Empire. And for those who don't know, auxiliary troops are soldiers that are not Roman but from other conquered or allied nations or tribes, and these auxiliary troops are then preferably led by formerly stolen and Roman-raised babies that are natives of said other nation or tribe. Basically, foreigners that the Roman army used as meat shields. You get me? Good. Enter Arminius and his brother Flavus, who were raised as Romans and raised well. They were taught Latin, rose to the rank of equite, a social rank below the aristocrats but above the common people, and once they were fully trained soldiers, they joined the Roman army as leaders of the Germanic auxiliary forces. And that's how we get to 6 AD. Arminius and Flavus are now in their early to mid-20s, and they are part of a military force sent to end a rebellion then known as Bellum Battonianum, but now known as the Great Illyrian Revolt of 6 to 9 AD. If the name wasn't a giveaway already, it was the Illyrians who revolted, led by chieftain Bato in parts of Rome that would today be known as Bosnia. Like the Germanic people, the Illyrians had been conquered by Rome and also were used as auxiliary troops for Rome's glory. One risk of using people you conquered as auxiliaries is that when they revolt, they are essentially rebels within your borders that you armed and trained in your ways. So the Illyrian revolt was serious business, and writer Suetonius later described it as the biggest threat to Rome since Hannibal. And considering that Hannibal almost ended Rome, even being in the same sentence as him is quite an honor. Enter Arminius, a man whose people were conquered by the Romans, used as auxiliaries to bleed for the Roman Empire, now sent to stop a revolt of people who were conquered by the Romans and were rebelling because they were tired of bleeding for the Roman Empire. You see where this is going, right? This war was like taking a How to Start a Rebellion 101 masterclass for Arminius.
You gonna learn today.
And to prepare for this rebellion, Arminius had to make sure he was well rested. And that obviously starts with a good night's sleep, which he always had thanks to using the Manta sleep mask. In fact, I happen to have the very model Arminius used, the Manta sound mask, which allows you to listen to anything while you have your mask on. A bit of blindfolded 50 shades of kinkiness with the lady so she doesn't know which angle you're coming from. Manta sound mask. Want to keep things interesting for your significant other in the bedroom by doing some Cyclops cosplay? Manta sound mask. And beyond those very obvious uses, you can even use the sound model to listen to music podcasts or ASMR while sleeping with a blackout mask on. Genius. And when I said blackout dark, I mean blackout dark. Even with the studio lights in my face, I cannot see a thing. So, you know what that means, right, fellas? You never know what's coming in your face when the lady does. I don't even know what I'm saying anymore. But I do know that if you want your own Manta sleep mask, then click the link in the description, go to mantasleep.com and use code BRIEFED to get 10% off on any mask. The sound model, the weighted model, the steaming model, cooling model, pro model, any model you want. 10% off of all these models, always with my code BRIEFED. But if you buy 2 sound models between April 16th to 22nd, you get the second Manta sound mask 50% off. So that's 10% off of the first Manta sound with code BRIEFED and 50% off of the second sound model automatically thanks to the Easter campaign from April 16th to 22nd. 2 masks for whatever needs you might have. Note that on mantasleep.com, you input the code BRIEFED at the very end during checkout when you enter shipping information. You get me, bruv? Alright, cool. Now, click that description link to level up your sleep and get that maximum rest like Arminius did before it was time to defend Rome against the rebels while ironically learning exactly how to rebel against Rome. Arminius noticed that the Romans were so overextended throughout their empire that they are very slow to react when caught off guard and not fighting on their terms, and highly disadvantaged when not fighting on their favorite territory. The rebelling Illyrians took advantage of the fact that the battles took place on their lands, that they knew better than the occupying oppressors, and the Illyrians resorted to a lot of guerrilla warfare because in open battle, the heavy armor and formations of the Romans could not be defeated, but hit-and-run tactics were able to wear them down. Arminius fought against the Illyrians, but he gained respect for these Illyrians, whom the Romans only ever called barbarians, the same derogatory term they used for Arminius' people, the same term they used for anyone that wasn't Roman, actually, because All of them were considered wild and uncivilized and marked for death if they didn't submit to Roman rule. Arminius respected that these Illyrians fought for their freedom and lands while his own Germanic people had given away theirs without a fight and given him away while they were at it. Arminius respected that these Illyrians were proud to call themselves enemies of Rome, while his people were proud to call themselves friends of Rome. Arminius saw a lot to admire in this rebellion and took note of every tactic and ambush that helped the Illyrians win a battle or three, because ultimately the might of Rome still won the war. And this was when Arminius took note of how Rome treated those who had dared to rebel: humiliation, torture, and death. Of course, we don't know at which moment exactly Arminius decided to betray Rome, or if he ever really considered it a betrayal, since you can't really betray what you were never loyal to. Maybe it's just because it fits best into most narratives, but most assume that it was after the Great Illyrian Revolt that Arminius started to actively plot against Rome. The Illyrians had shown him that the Roman Empire might not be defeated in its entirety, but it was so overextended and stretched so thin that if a rebellion is large enough and smart enough, it could lead Rome to consider the oppression of a nation to be more trouble than it's worth. And this was exactly what Arminius had in mind for Germania. Before the Illyrian rebellion was completely put down, Arminius had already served his purpose in the war, and Rome sent him elsewhere. In 7 AD, in his early 20s, Arminius was sent back to his homeland, to the Cherusci people, to resume his role as heir to the throne and talk of the might of the Roman Empire, displayed to his people with his mere presence, proof of their superior education, training, nutrition, superior everything. Civilized Prince Arminius was to be the example of how good life under the Roman Empire could be, and if Arminius chose not to be, Rome still kept his brother Flavus in Rome as backup. So Arminius returned to his tribe after 13 years, returned as a Roman auxiliary commander, still on call for duty whenever Rome needs him, and tasked to train more auxiliary troops from amongst his people to one day fight for Rome's glory as a more disposable force. Around this time, Publius Quintilius Varus was appointed the first governor of Germania and sent to the region to maintain stability and loyalty. And how do you best inspire stability and loyalty? Exactly, with fear. So Varus led regular military campaigns through the Germanic regions to let everybody know,
I own your house.
But these military campaigns through foreign lands were difficult, so Rome was heavily dependent on their Germanic auxiliary forces as scouts, and they needed a man that actually spoke their barbaric language and that could lead them. And there was one Germanic of the Cherusci tribe, a Cheruscan nobleman named Segestes, who was choking on Rome's meat so hard that he got off on the idea of helping the Roman military, and once he heard that the new Roman governor of Germania needed a traitor to help the Romans oppress the Germanic people, Segestes was like,
I volunteer as tribute!
But despite his willingness to gargle Romans, Segestes was just a barbarian in their eyes, and not an option. Not when Arminius was currently in these lands and available. Arminius spoke fluent Latin, was trained by the Roman army, had already commanded auxiliaries and proven his valor and love for Rome in helping fight a rebellion. He was the perfect candidate to lead Varus's auxiliary legions for his military campaign in Germania. This was a huge blow for Segestes, and not the Roman kind of blow he wished for. No, it just hurt his feelings. Segestes was mad jealous of Arminius, and then, to make it worse, Arminius also took Segestes' daughter, Tosnelda, with him on this campaign, even though Segestes explicitly forbid her from being with Arminius. So Segestus was salty, very salty. Remember that, salty Segestus. I'll even give him a title card so that name remains in your memory. Arminius joined the Roman campaign, and Varus entirely trusted him with the lives of the 3 legions he took into Germanic territory, the 17th, 18th, and 19th legion to be exact, which is a total of roughly 15,000 Roman soldiers, all at the mercy of their auxiliary scouts led by Arminius to navigate them through these foreign lands from tribe to tribe to talk to them about their Lord and Savior Rome, or kill them if they don't accept their Lord and Savior Rome. Varus truly thought him and Arminius were Romanizing the region and establishing Roman control, stopping rebellions and advancing the glory of the empire. But Arminius had a different plan altogether. As leader of the auxiliary scouts, Arminius would ride ahead to each of the Germanic tribes who were scattered across these lands, at times kilometers apart, and as small as just 100 or even just 50 people. Arminius was meant to ride days ahead to prepare each tribe for the arrival of Varus and the Romans so that they show a proper response and are prepared to bow to Rome's glory. But really, what Arminius did was use that time to tell these tribes of what he had witnessed during the Illyrian revolt. Rome could be defeated. He told them that he had trained and fought amongst the Romans, that he knew how their legions work, how they fight, knew their tactics, their strengths, but most of all, their weaknesses, that they were overextended, busy patrolling borders and maintaining peace in their massive empire, that they had only 3 legions in the region, legions that were cut off from the rest of Rome, which could not afford to send reinforcements. He told all these oppressed tribes that if they trust him, he can lead them to freedom and defeat Rome. But of course, a lot of these small tribes felt like they had more to lose against mighty Rome than they had to gain, and preferred Roman rule. And other tribes had beef with Arminius' Rome-loving Cherusci heritage and didn't trust them, especially not when Arminius had very obviously been Romanized and was nothing but a Roman lapdog in their eyes. And he is the one to lead this rebellion? Other tribes didn't like the fact that Arminius asked some other group of Germanic people that they weren't on good terms with, so for one reason or another, many of the countless Germanic tribes refused Arminius, and it took him years to even talk to all these scattered tribes, and it took him great effort to convince enough people to gather a fighting force. But eventually, Arminius had about 15,000 Germanic warriors who vowed to stand beside him when the time comes. And he did it all right under the nose of Roman General Varus. And man, back in my teenage years, I couldn't even download some Pamela Anderson and Carmen Electra pictures without getting caught. But Arminius did all of this right under his guardian's nose, man. In fact, Arminius legit had Varus thinking he was talking to these people about the greatness of Rome. Which, I mean, that's the good old bait and switch. I also had my parents thinking I was studying when I was Googling Pam and Carmen would save search off.
You know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm saying. You know.
And how could Varus not think that? Because the reality of Arminius' treacherous plans was that, knowing that Arminius was building an army to fight against Rome, all these Germanic tribes stopped what plans of revolt they might have had. That meant that throughout Varus's entire military campaign to Romanize these lands, Germania was super peaceful. Everybody was like, do I love the glory of Rome? What? Does an elephant sleep standing up? Oh, you don't know? Well, I know. Yes, he does. Yes, he does. Just like I love Rome. Tell Augustus I send my love, and come on, let me kiss that golden eagle. Man, I love Rome. Rome's awesome. Varus must have been thinking that this is the easiest military campaign ever, and he loved Arminius for it, of course. Arminius was committing the perfect betrayal, and the details of it became more and more fleshed out. Arminius had secret meetings with the leaders of the most important tribes, and together, but mostly based on Arminius's knowledge and experience, they came up with an exact plan on how to defeat Varus's 3 legions and end Rome's control over Germania. Arminius would lead the legions through the Teutoburg Forest, along a particularly narrow and muddy path where the sheer weight of the Romans' armor and equipment would make traversal hell. Couple that with the supply wagons and their lack of knowledge of the forest, the Romans would be sitting ducks for an ambush. And to shift things even more in favor of the Germanic attackers, Arminius and his men then excavated entire parts along that chosen path and filled them with water to block off whole sections. Or they added foliage to already dense forest to make it seem impassable. Then they built a massive wall out of mud, camouflaged it with leaves to create an ambush point where they could trap the Romans with their backs against said wall. The Germanic warriors turned this path through the Teutoburg Forest into a death trap, and so everything was good to go. After joining Varus's military campaign in 7 AD, now in 9 AD, 2 years later, Arminius would end it. Except that Varus then decided to actually end it on his own. He didn't feel the need to continue anymore. This military campaign had been going so well. All these tribes were so peaceful that he saw no need for it. As far as he was concerned, Germania was legit Romanized, and so he decided to call an end to the campaign just short of the ambush point, and Varus chose to instead set up a permanent base from which he would comfortably govern Germania as a politician rather than a warlord. And Arminius, who kind of caused this peace, he was like,
I'll be damned.
but he had a solution. Arminius told 2 of his allied tribes to attack a settlement in his homelands of Cherusci and make a big fuss out of it, spread rumors as much as fires to make sure the Romans definitely hear about this attack. Then, when Varus inevitably did hear about this attack, Arminius told him that the best way to end the revolt and prove the glory of Rome was to side with the attacked Cherusci and defeat the defiant Germanic rebels. This would show the other tribes that if you align yourself with Rome, Rome will fight for you. And also, if you rebel, Rome will annihilate you. Varus agreed. This was the perfect plan, and again, Arminius proved himself to be a true Roman. And after the fake rebellion was crushed, Arminius had Varus's ear and trust, more so than before, and Arminius urged Varus to keep the military campaign going because, as he just saw, once Rome stopped showing force, the rebels start showing heart. They need to show them who's boss, and Varus agreed again, so the legions were back on the move towards the grave Arminius had prepared for them. But then, oh then, a traitor arose. Salty Segestus was still pissed at Arminius. Man, Arminius was campaigning with Rome for years. This was literally Salty Segestus' wet dream. And to make it worse, Arminius had taken Segestus' daughter, Tosnelda, with him on this military campaign all this time. So Arminius didn't even appreciate all the Roman swords he could be bending over for to receive Rome's glory. Segestus was livid. This was
Unforgivable.
And as a member of the Cherusci tribe, Segestus obviously knew all about Arminius' plan, knew all about the ambush, all about the game Arminius was playing and the trap he was leading the Romans into. And this disloyal punk went and asked for an audience with Varus to tell him all about what Arminius was planning, down to the last detail. And when Varus was done listening to him, Varus was like, Varus didn't believe a word Due said. Varus loved Arminius so much that the mere idea of him being a traitor was ridiculous. I mean, Arminius just helped him crush a rebellion of his fellow Germanic tribesmen. Arminius just suggested to continue a military campaign when Varus was ready to chill. If anything, Arminius seemed more like an overzealous Roman than anybody. So whatever it is that Sergestus was saying here, he was obviously just jealous that Arminius was chosen over him. And trying to spread rumors? Please. As a Roman, Varus knew all too well that people like to spread rumors to bring others down. Sergestus was dismissed as a liar, but he still almost ruined Arminius' plans because with all that time lost, Varus told Arminius that he wanted to put the military campaign on hold because
winter is coming.
Varus wanted to wait until spring to continue, but Arminius obviously couldn't have that, and somehow was even able to use this to his advantage, and he told Varus, don't worry, I got a secret shortcut path that will lead us straight to the rebels so we can crush them and be back before winter. Psst. Music to Varus's ears. This Arminius guy must really love killing barbarians, so Varus agreed to Arminius' plan, and at this point Varus probably would have spread some cheeks if Arminius asked, but all Arminius needed was for Varus to follow him to the ambush point that they prepared, which he did on September 8th in 9 AD. Once Varus and his 3 legions were on the narrow path that only went one way and led towards the wall of death, Arminius delivered his last lie. He told Varus he would ride ahead with his auxiliary troops, ride ahead to round up some more support for the cause, some more loyalists who love nothing more than Rome and killing barbarians. And he told them, just you keep going that way. There's really only one way through this forest, and I'll be back before you reach the end. Trust me. And with that, Arminius was off to unite with his loyal men hiding in the forest, the bushes, behind the wall, ready to kill 15,000 Romans that were now just moments away. And once the Romans were in range, 10,000 Germanic warriors blitzed them. Blitzed the Romans so hard that many of them were dead before they even knew what had happened. The rest were slow to react with their heavy armor on uneven, muddy terrain, tripping over themselves trying to get into their drilled formations, which they couldn't because they were trapped between the ambushing Germanic warriors and a wall. The ambush worked to perfection, and even just this first wave of 10,000 Germanic warriors was enough to completely overwhelm the Romans to the point where Varus took his own life rather than being taken prisoner. And all the while, Arminius and his cavalry hadn't even joined the battle yet. Maybe he was waiting for just the perfect moment, or maybe he knew the battle was already won and wanted as many of the men from the other tribes to suffer the casualties so that the Cherusci tribe would emerge as the strongest once the Romans are defeated. Either way, Arminius and his cavalry waited and only joined the battle in the end to finish the Romans off. And the few Romans who survived became prisoners of war, and some of them were eventually sacrificed to the Germanic gods, who loved themselves a bit of blood and sacrifice. Arminius had won. Trained by the Romans themselves, he defeated their 17th, 18th, and 19th legion after fooling Varus, the man who had trusted Arminius fully. And as one last screw you to the fool Varus, Arminius had Varus's head cut off and sent it to one of those Rome-loving Germanic tribes that had refused to join the rebellion to show them what they had accomplished in the name of freedom. Back in Rome, once the Roman emperor heard about what happened to Varus and, more importantly, what happened to 3 of his total of 29 legions, man, Emperor Augustus was so furious over the loss of those legions that the name of Varus and his family was ruined, and the names of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legion were never used again due to shame and superstition. This defeat was devastating. Rome was already stretched thin, and losing this many soldiers was a disaster, but even worse than that would be to let an attack against Roman superiority go unpunished, especially since, after Arminius won and news of his victory spread, many other tribes in Germania who weren't initially a part of the rebellion suddenly grew a pair and started to attack and burn down any and all settlements that Rome still had in the region. Rome had to react in force, or else others would find the courage to rebel. The Roman Empire could only remain as long as all its subjects believe that Rome is invincible. So a redeem team was formed. 8 legions were sent to Germania, and the captain of this redeem team was one of Rome's greatest generals, Germanicus. And yes, the name is a huge spoiler alert, because when Roman generals are named after a different nation, it's probably because they murdered a lot of those people. In 14 AD, 29-year-old Germanicus came down on Germania with the wrath of the many Roman gods, and he used the 8 legions to spread terror throughout the region. Germanicus did not care for an immediate rematch with Arminius. He cared about destroying all those little Germanic tribes that were isolated, that had a fighting force which numbers maybe 100 people at best. Germanicus wanted to make them suffer for what their kinsman Arminius did. So the Roman redeem team spread out and annihilated so many tribes that soon the entire region feared the terror of Rome, and many blamed Arminius for inviting his wrath. Germanicus very plainly showed the Germanic people what their options are: rebel and die a hero under excruciating pain with nowhere to hide, or live under Roman rule. And to those who made the right choice, Germanicus really did show mercy. Even if you stood with Arminius in the past, if you were willing to turn your back on him now and accepted the glory of Rome, Germanicus was willing to let you live. More and more people abandoned Arminius' cause in fear of Rome. But Arminius still had enough men to his name to plan a counterattack. But then, a traitor rose amongst his inner circle. Yep, Arminius was holding Salty Segestus prisoner because he was still his father-in-law, so execution was an option. But Salty Segestus managed to send his son to meet with Germanicus so that he can lead the Romans to Segestus' location and free him. And when the Romans came, they did free him, but also took his daughter, aka Arminius' wife, Tosnelda, prisoner, along with her and Arminius' 3-year-old son. Arminius was livid, and he was like,
"It's personal now! It's personal now! He must die!"
and it was really personal, because guess who was fighting alongside Germanicus and his troops also? Do you remember the name Flavus, as in Flavus, the brother of Arminius, who was also taken as a baby and raised in Rome but stayed behind all this time? Flavus became fiercely loyal to the Roman Empire that was out to massacre his people and had just taken his sister-in-law and nephew prisoner. And when it was time for Germanicus and Arminius to finally clash, Flavus stood with Rome in 2 major battles that took place in Germania in 16 AD. The Battle of Idistaviso and the Battle of the Angevarian Wall. Thanks to Germanicus' 8 legions spreading terror all over Germania, Arminius was not able to prepare some ambush, so he had to face the Romans at what they did best: an open battle. And so the Romans won these 2 big clashes, but still, Arminius was able to hurt them with some hit-and-run tactics and forest skirmishes, enough so that Germanicus also suffered heavy casualties and was not able to decisively win the war against the Germanic people. Germania's lands were too vast, the tribes were too scattered and too many, and the foundation of Arminius' rebellion was too strong. It could not be overcome without sending in more resources, but back in Rome, Emperor Augustus had since died, and the new emperor, Tiberius, decided that enough was enough. Rome had made its point. Rebel, and you will suffer consequences. And Tiberius believed those consequences had been made clear. by Germanicus and his legions. The fact that many abandoned the rebellion was enough of a victory. The fact that they were able to capture Arminius' wife and son and could parade them around Rome, that meant that they could spin this story as they saw fit. And on top of that, Germanicus was able to recover some of the remains of the 17th, 18th, and 19th Legion, as well as the Golden Eagle standards of the 17th and 18th Legion. Rome would make sure that the people would learn of this story as a Roman victory. So as far as Tiberius was concerned, Rome had avenged its loss, maintained its aura of invincibility, and any more warfare in Germania would just unnecessarily deplete Rome's resources and risk allegiance they couldn't spare. Germanicus was called back to Rome, where he was received as a hero in a massive celebration. But ultimately, history remembers Arminius as the real winner. He had accomplished his goal. No matter how Rome chose to spin it, in the end, the truth remains that the Romans retreated from the Germanic lands that Arminius had liberated. He withstood their response, and the spirit of his rebellion was never fully crushed. And now, his people were free. And then his own people killed Arminius. I'm serious. The same people he united ultimately killed him. Arminius got a little too king-like for their liking. He saw himself as the ruler of all of Germania and must have forgotten that the whole point of this rebellion was freedom and not trade a Roman overlord for a Germanic overlord. So they killed 38-year-old Arminius in 21 AD to live free from Arminius' rule. And without Arminius' rule, they then collapsed into civil war, fighting and killing each other again. But hey, at least they did that in freedom. Except then these tribal wars became so violent and so bad that Cherusci eventually asked Rome to help to establish stability in Germania. And what did Rome do? Arminius' nephew, the son of his brother Flavus, whose name was Italicus, and who, just like his father Flavus, had Cheruscan royal blood in him but was fiercely loyal to Rome, Italicus was sent to the region and installed as a Roman puppet king.